on the species aspect of biodiversity. Next, please. If you haven't already, I believe Neville has it posted as a link for a film. It's called Green Fire by this gentleman, Aldo Leopold, and he's like a leading environmentalist, conservationist, and basically, you know, the way that he thinks, along with many others, is the more harm that you do on nature, the more repercussions there's going to be to it. It's going to be harder trying to correct the problem, if it even can be corrected. Go ahead. So what we're going to talk about is extinction. There's what's called background extinction, and basically that is natural occurring extinction. Unfortunately, it does happen, okay? But this natural extinction happens very slowly. It's not something that just happens overnight for the most part, okay? And with that, there's species extinction. So that can be on different levels. That could be where a species goes extinct locally, okay? Or it can be within that particular ecosystem, or what's called biological extinction. It's just gone off the face of the planet overall. So there's different levels of it. Is it just locally, or is it globally as well? Next. So example of this is the passenger pigeon. It used to be one of the most abundant birds. It was so abundant that when it would migrate, like the sky was blackened for 3 days, because that's how many birds there were. It took 3 days for the whole flock of those birds to fly when they're migrating. So it tells you just how huge the population was. And that was estimated back in 1813. If you guys are into birds, there's this gentleman, Audubon. There's the Audubon Society. And basically, those are the bird people, ornithology, okay? And so they witnessed this back in 1813. Again, so many of those pigeons, it took 3 days for them to migrate through. But by 1900, we hunted them to extinction. So that tells you just how many there were and how fast we were able to take them out. Within 100 years, we made that species go extinct. Pretty crazy stuff, huh? So what contributes to them have gone extinct was habitat loss. That's usually the first and foremost reason why a species goes extinct or becomes endangered. Commercial hunting. Back in the 1800s and early 1900s, especially in the 1900s, they didn't necessarily hunt birds for to eat, such as duck, okay? The people still hunt ducks in order to eat. But what they did is they took these pretty birds, they had really pretty feathers, and they killed them for these real fancy hats that they used to have. So that's one of the reasons why this bird went extinct, okay? Habitat loss, overhunting, and they're easy to kill. When they were that thick, it's easy to kill a whole bunch at one time, versus if you only have one or two flying, trying to hit that one bird isn't necessarily all that easy, versus when you have hundreds of thousands, okay, just, you know, you're bound to hit something at some point. So that's what happened with that. So with extinction, what happens is you have human activity, okay, that basically we're disturbing that area or we're polluting that area. And so with that, okay, we inhabit 60 to 80% of the Earth's land surface, okay? 50% of this is due to surface waters. But we pretty much, as humans, we can go inhabit almost any part of the world anymore. Doesn't necessarily mean we want to inhabit all these areas because of climate conditions, okay? But there is that possibility. So they've projected that annual extinction rate is less than 1% a year, which doesn't sound bad. But again, we're kind of speeding up these things. Go ahead. So the projected rate now is at 1%, okay? And they're expecting within the next 50 to 100 years. Unfortunately, that number of percentage, how many are going to go extinct, is going to increase. And so the reasons, okay, biodiversity loss. And so when we start getting, whether it's species biodiversity, whether it's genetic biodiversity, whether it's the ecosystem biodiversity, when you start reducing that biodiversity, it really starts affecting the whole planet, okay? If you have more species within that environment, it can kind of afford to lose some species easier than other environments where there's far less. So we have these biodiversity centers. There's kind of like what are called these hot spots. Certain areas of the world, California is actually one of those hot spots within the whole world where we have these biodiversity centers, these hot spots where we're starting to see a rapid decline in species, whether it's plants or animals. Okay, go ahead. So the challenges is, again, this natural extinction, it takes a long time for that to happen, all right? And only 2 million species of animals or plants have been identified. And we know there's a lot more out there, but when you're in that thick jungle, you might not have seen that insect, maybe that plant was covered up. We have this one instructor on campus that goes every summer around the world, and more often than not, every summer he finds a new species. And I'm like, how do you do that? That's way cool, So only 2 million species have been identified, and really, despite how much we think we know, as we find these new species, what we end up learning is, like with you guys, as you start taking more and more classes, you start realizing how much you actually don't know. And that's what we're starting to realize. It's like, oh, we thought we knew a lot, but oh, I didn't know there was that species. So we're starting to learn even more. So what we try to do is get this data, okay? And not only get data, but better data, because maybe what we had in the past wasn't really done all that well. So we try to get this better data, and we try to develop these better models as far as how to get that data. So that brings us to these different topics. And there's what's called endangered and threatened species within the Endangered Species Act. Basically, you consider a certain population, okay, and how many individuals do you have left of that population? And if you start seeing that number declining, you become a species of concern. It's like, hey, we need to start watching the numbers. They're going down. We don't necessarily know why. Maybe we do know why. And so after the species concern, you actually get put on the endangered species list. That's a threatened species. You still have members, but they're not as many as there should be, okay? And they're considered to be vulnerable. And if their numbers keep declining, that goes to the next level, what's called endangered species. Because basically what we're trying to prevent is extinction, okay? And if you're endangered, the next level, that next step is extinction. Go ahead. So more often than not, unfortunately, once a species is put on the endangered species list, it pretty much stays there. However, there has been recently, for that matter, examples where they've been taken off. That's what's called delisting. Or you can do what's called downlisting. That's when you're endangered species, but your numbers are starting to come back, and so you're not endangered, but you are now threatened. Okay, but then let's say you're threatened, but your numbers are coming back better and better. So 2 examples are the bald eagle, and this one here, the California brown pelican. They used to be endangered and threatened species, and it's kind of a catch-22. Due to human interaction, that's why they got endangered, but due to human interaction, that's why they're now completely off the list. Go ahead. So here's that guy again, Edward Wilson, remember the father of biodiversity. And basically what he feels is that the first species, animal species to go are the big, the slow ones, the ones that can't reproduce as fast. Maybe they have these valuable parts, okay? So those are the ones that are typically the easiest to go. So this is a picture taken by Neville from Costa Rica. Not many, but over 5 years ago, I guess now. Him and another instructor, Dino Bozanelis, who teaches political science, they would take a group of students to Costa Rica. it was anywhere from 7 to 14 days. And if you really want to know about sustainability, Costa Rica is the place to go to for that. They're like the sustainable country of the world, so to speak. Okay, they're like the foster child for sustainability. So Neville took this picture. This isn't the natural habitat where you would find a sloth. What is it on? It's on a road here, okay, or street. That's not natural. And what do you know about sloths? They're incredibly slow. If you guys ever saw Zootopia, you know, he's at the DMV. He's going very slow. So they always look very happy, though. They're cute little guys. But because they're slow, they're easy targets. And they're rather big, too. That makes you another easy target. Okay? And so if they are trying to literally cross the road, I mean, it's kind of hard not to notice this big sloth, but maybe you just don't care. Maybe you saw something cool off the side and you're driving and you ran over the sloths, that sort of thing. It's not, they can't move quickly. Okay, go ahead. Keep clicking. Yep, like you're playing a video game. Okay, I think you're done. So these are different animals, flora or fauna. You guys know what I mean by flora? What? Plants. Okay, sounds like flower. Fauna is animals. Sounds like a baby fawn. Okay, those are the science terms that we use. Instead of saying plants and animals, we say flora and fauna. So these are different examples of animals, flora or fauna, that are becoming endangered. Okay, threatened or endangered. One, because they're big. What do we use them for? Maybe it's more just for because I killed the animal sort of thing, which I'm totally not in agreement with. And some here, African violets and orchids. It's like, what? You know? But yeah, we're taking them faster out of nature than they can reproduce. Now that might be different than what you buy at the store. Maybe there is an actual nursery that's all they do. In fact, there is one rather locally about an hour away from us, Gerblers, orchids, that's all they do. They just propagate orchids. They don't take them from the wild anymore. That's all they do is propagate them within the greenhouse and then they sell them. So they're not taking those plants from the wild. Okay, go ahead. Okay. So biodiversity is important, especially species biodiversity, due to that natural capita. What are we getting from them as well? Well, sometimes we don't even know what we're getting because we kill them off before we could even figure it out. So reasons to prevent extinction, pollination. Okay, not all of us are all that interested in insects, but the fact of the matter is they play a huge role in pollination. And if we don't have pollination with our plants, we're not going to get our fruits and veggies from it. Okay, some of these animals are natural pests. There's what's called biocontrols. Think of like ladybugs. We all like our little ladybugs. And if you guys have gardens, if you have a rose plant, especially in the springtime, it'll get infested with these little green bugs, these aphids. But then there's these other bugs, such as the ladybug or the praying mantis, that will naturally take care of them. Okay, so if you wipe out the praying mantis or the ladybugs, then your aphid population is going to go out of whack and your plants are going to suffer as a result. Ecotourism, that's a huge one. You know, that's a really cool industry nowadays where, you know, whether it's whitewater rafting or you go to Costa Rica and you go to live up in the tree canopies for a week, whatever it might be, but there's a huge industry within ecotourism that provides not only this experience in the outdoors, but it's a teaching experience as well. Okay, so go ahead. So what do we have here? Bumblebee, okay? Remember I said about the pollination? This is a big concern. You guys should be like in that whole uh-oh moment because as of this year, what has happened with the bumblebee? It was put on the endangered species list. And this is like a #1 pollinator. Okay? It's so crazy that nowadays that like the almond tree growers here in California, Okay, we need the bees for pollination, but because there's so few, they actually have to rent bee colonies in order for the pollination to occur. People steal bee colonies from people because they're worth a lot of money. So instead of just having your open backyard and having these beehives, people are literally having to build fences to prevent people come stealing beehives. I know, it's crazy, right? So the honeybees, 1/3 of human food supply is due to insect pollinated plants. Okay? And so what is happening is these beekeepers, they're experiencing what's called CCD, colony collapse disorder. For a while, they didn't know why this was happening, but they had speculations, and they basically pretty much figured it out at this point. They have the severe decline in the bee population. I think up to 40 to 50% of bee populations every year are dying off. Okay, and any ideas why that might be? What's causing such a severe drop-off? Pesticide use. Yeah, because again, when you use these pesticides, I understand sometimes it needs to be used, especially, it's one thing for our smaller gardens. Okay, that's more manageable, but when you're talking about acres and acres and acres of farmland, okay, releasing ladybugs, that really isn't sustainable, because part of being sustainable is affordable. Okay, and when you're talking about buying a pack of 50 or 100 ladybugs, and that costs like $9, that's not going to cover hundreds of acres of farm field. Okay, so they have to resort to these chemicals. But the thing is, when you use these pesticides, you really think it's only killing the bad bugs? No, anything that comes in contact. All right, so go ahead. So what this is showing you is flora, okay? Plants that are out in the wild that they've realized they have medicinal purposes, and not always just medicinal. If you take this here, the neem tree, if you guys are into gardening, you know about neem oil. This is a natural oil that you can use as a pesticide instead of using chemicals. You can even use like Dawn detergent. Doesn't necessarily have to be Dawn, but you can use detergent, diluted detergent, to kill those aphids, because they're soft-bodied, and so they take it right in. And what the soap does, other than just like poisoning them, it kind of suffocates them too, but yet it doesn't harm the plant. So, you know, the thing is, there's this movie, it's called, now I forgot. I know, Sean Connery, oh my gosh, I forgot the name of it. But the story behind it is, he goes out to the rainforest and everything, and they're cutting it down, as we know that happens. And then there's this flower, and he ends up, by mistake, finding the cure for cancer. Okay? It wasn't that he was intentionally, I mean, they were trying to, but then they ended up finding it, and it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. And so, you know, the cure for a lot of things could very well be out there, but if we're destroying them before we even have chance to do any of these medical researches on them, then how are we to know? Go ahead. So with this, with the species, they all have their niche. You guys remember what niche meant? You know, what their role in life is, essentially. Okay? And so they all have their part that they play within that ecosystem. And so if you start taking out too many of those parts, that system is going to start falling apart, and eventually it's going to actually collapse. So you have this ethical dilemma that comes into play with biologists as far as which species do we save? Because there's only so many people, so much money to allow us to save so many critters out there, okay? And one of the critters that we tend not to think about, which is kind of not good, not kind of not good, but it's really not good, are these microorganisms. Things that you can't even see with the naked eye, but basically if we didn't have these microorganisms, life would not exist. We wouldn't exist if we didn't have the microorganisms in our gut. Okay, if these microorganisms weren't in the soil, okay, this is a reason for having such good healthy soil, is because of these microorganisms. And if they weren't there, things will start going bad very quickly. So that whole dilemma in ethics goes into a situation that I've encountered myself within field biology. You guys know what bird this is?
Falcon?
It is. It's the peregrine falcon, a rather small raptor bird. Okay, easily identifiable because it has, you know, these markings right here. They use them in New York City. Do you know what they use falconry for in New York City? Yeah, the pigeons. They have a huge pigeon problem. So they use peregrine falcons. What's really cool about them is they're really, really fast. When I say really, really fast, they're like over 180 miles an hour type fast. They don't literally fly that fast. What they do is they kind of dive bomb and then they tuck their wings back and they just go for it. And so we actually witnessed one time on a beach, really weren't sure what we saw, to tell you the truth. And then once we figured it out, we saw this peregrine falcon perched on a radar, of all things, on a tower. Well, being really tall, okay, makes a really nice perching site, and you can see the whole colony of this endangered bird here, okay? And so basically, because they come in at that speed, you don't really see what happened. All you see is a big puff of feathers in the air. And so here you have an endangered bird, okay, a protected bird, and here's another protected bird. So what are you supposed to do? Who are you going to actually protect out of that? Well, there's these series of films called Trials of Life. Okay, that's when you like see the big orca eating, the seal, that sort of thing. That's naturally what's supposed to happen. So we're not going to intervene with that. But then there would be situations where, if I only have X amount of money, I can only basically help one of these two populations. So then you have to make the decision, which one are you going to help? Well, sometimes one of those deciding factors is sometimes you have so few of that particular population, you kind of just have to, take it with the chance and go with the one that has the better chance of surviving. Okay, so go next. So these are two endangered and threatened species that we have here in the high desert. This guy here, he is in riparian areas. What do you know about riparian areas here in the high desert? They do exist, which is kind of weird. But what is our riparian area? It's the Mojave River, okay? And so we have this guy here. It's not due to habitat destruction. This guy here is more of what's called an invasive species that's preventing the native vegetation to flourish the way it should. Okay, this guy, you guys all know about the tortoise. Why is he endangered or threatened? He's actually threatened, not endangered, but he's protected under the Endangered Species Act. So why is that? Habitat destruction. Despite they have a lot of habitat, but with these solar fields going in, they can't just build a solar field knowing that there's these burrows of the tortoise. Okay, they have to have these biologists go out, like Brian Leatherman. They go out and they do these surveys, trying to find where the homes are, and they can translocate them. They can capture them and put them in a new area. Okay, but you can only do that so much before you overcrowd the area. Any other ideas? Other reasons? That's not the only reason that has caused our desert tortoise to become protected. Vegetation loss? Some vegetation loss, yeah. Back in the day, before these guys were protected, I guess it was popular for people to come out to the desert, as it still is, but I guess it seemed like it was cool to own a tortoise. Okay, again, they're slow. It's not hard to capture these guys. Okay, they don't even eat fast. They eat slow, so it's not like they're gonna snap. They can try to snap at you, but if you get them from behind, they can't get you. So one of their problems was people were taking them home. Okay, but these guys get rather big after a long period of time, but they get a lot bigger than they're expecting, or maybe they were just too boring. I don't know what the reason was, but they decide to bring them back into the wild, and they end up getting disease. Okay, the third reason why these guys are in the condition they are is because of our population. With their population, we have more trash, we have more litter, okay? And we don't necessarily always have it secured the way that we should. And there is this native population of ravens that occur up here. But what occurs up here now as far as their population is just skyrocketed. And with that, what they've done is they started going out to the desert, and the ravens have a really thick bill, and they peck through the shell of the baby tortoise, and they end up dying. So there's 3 different reasons there that has been impacting the tortoise. Go ahead. So we've seen this before as far as what causes a species to become threatened or endangered is due to this HIPCO. H is habitat destruction, degradation, or what's called fragmentation. Think about like when you're coming up the Cajon Pass. That's fragmentation. That used to be one continuous mountain range, okay? And so now essentially you have 2 islands. You have that freeway that's going through, and it's totally sealed off. Unless you're a bird, you still can fly back and forth. But if you're like a mountain lion, the chances of it trying to cross, I mean, there's always traffic there. So these roads can act like it fragments, it splits up that one continuous habitat into 2 separate ones, okay? You can have these invasive species, whether it's flora or fauna, which basically outcompetes what should be there, okay? The first P on HIPCO is population growth. And because we have a population growth, a human population, we're increasing the amount of resources that we use. The second P in the HIPCO is pollution, whether it's air, whether it's water, whether it's soil. People don't think about that, but there is soil pollution that occurs as well. So you guys know what the C is? Climate. Yep, the climate. And what's the O? Overexploitation. Yeah, whether it's overusing, overhunting, we tapped out. Oh, I forgot I can't click. I'm like, what's going on? So invasive species, we do have them up here in the high desert. This one we've talked about before. You remember the name of this one? It's the tamarisk or salt cedar. Tamarisk is actually the genus name of this particular plant. This is what it looks like when it's not in bloom. This is when it is in bloom. It's kind of lavender, fluffy. I mean, it does look pretty. I hate to admit it. But the thing is, it doesn't offer any habitat for anything, really. The birds don't nest in it. The birds don't forage, eat the seed. And it's outcompeting the native cottonwoods and the willow that should be there. Okay, so they have these task force that go out and they go eradicate, but it takes several times in order to get this tamarisk eradicated, because you go to cut it down and they do spray it, okay, with herbicides, but then you'll still get those runners, those sprouts that come up. And so then they got to keep monitoring to make sure that it's not resprouting. Go ahead. This one here. We see this all the time, don't we? Tumbleweed. That's the common name. What's another common name for tumbleweed? Russian thistle. So why does it have that name? Because that's where it actually came from. Believe it or not, the tumbleweed is not a native species here, despite how much we see. You would think it is because of how much we see, but it's actually from Russia. This is at, I don't know if you can tell, but University Boulevard, this is right off the, was it 215 area in San Bernardino? Okay, I guess they made this giant, that's about all it's good for. And how it disperses its seed is after it gets a full size, it dries out, the wind comes, it breaks off, and it tumbles, and as it tumbles, it's dispersing its seed. The thing is, you don't want to chop it down. Some people come and they'll scrape the land, which isn't good. If you mow the land, you want to make sure you have a bag on your lawnmower, because each one of these little parts that it spits out has the potential of becoming a whole new plant. So you just chopped up this big tumbleweed in like a million little pieces. You literally could have a million tumbleweed come into play. So it does outcompete the native species that should be here. Tortoises, they don't eat it, and yet, as you were saying, Sam, these invasive species can outcompete what should be there, and that could be a plant that maybe the tortoise is trying to eat. Go ahead. So as we said, the C in HIPCO is climate change, okay? We're going to have a whole chapter just on that topic in itself. And the O is overexploitation. And just to give you a heads up, I hope nobody gets too squirmy, but there are some graphic slides in here, especially when we get to this topic of it. Go ahead. Keep clicking. So what this is representing, it's out of your book, figure 5-6. 2 more times, I believe. Thank you. It's showing you what they believe the range of that particular species to have been. It ranges. This is 100 years ago. This is saying about 1,600 years ago. But it's showing you this bluish purple color, what they thought it used to be, and then this reddish color, what it is now. So severely impacted. Okay. So how does that happen? Sometimes these invasive species are introduced not with bad intentions. They bring it in maybe as a food source. Maybe it came in with some cargo. Okay, sometimes it wasn't even brought in with any intention, and sometimes they do intention, such as erosion control, and then they realize, oh, that wasn't the best species to use. If you guys ever go up to Big Bear in the springtime, there's this bright yellow bush. If you guys ever notice that, that's actually invasive species. What Caltrans didn't know is that it was an invasive species, and the reason why they were using it was for erosion control. Okay, so sometimes we do these oops moments. We don't necessarily do bad things on purpose. The thing is, with these invasive species, these non-native species, is because they're brought into this new area, more than likely they don't have any predators that keep them in check. There's no competition, okay? What would normally keep them in check, parasites and pathogens, that just doesn't exist for them, okay? What naturally would take care of them, it just doesn't work for them. Go ahead. Some are stowaways, okay? And think about it. It used to take not days, not weeks, but months to travel around the world. Nowadays, you can be anywhere within a place within the world within 24 hours. So we can make these circumstances happen on a much faster scale. An example is the Argentina ant, fire ant, was introduced in the 30s and is severely overtaken the native ants that should be here. And the fire ants, they're not known for what's the word I want? Pollinating. There's no benefit to having the fire ants here. I mean, they have their place in Argentina, but as far as here, what they do is they outcompete our native ants. And in fact, they're so bad is that, I mean, they kill things that are like thousands times bigger than themselves, okay? People are allergic, they kill baby deer, birds, so that it's a big problem. Go ahead. So this is like just the tip of the iceberg. You can go on a website, just type in introduced species, invasive species. These are ones that are here in the U.S., depending where you are in the U.S. There's this one here, the nutria, that is a problem up in Oregon. They hang out in the drainage ditches and canals. Okay, they can get as big as, I've heard, as a German Shepherd. Okay, so I know you're like, whoa, that's pretty darn big. Here for the high desert, what has been a problem is this little guy, a zebra mussel. You're like, okay, it's a mussel. It's stationary. It's not like it moves around or anything, and it's tiny. It's a little bit bigger than your thumbnail. Okay, huge, huge problem in the Great Lakes. You go to Lake Michigan, and you can, as I have, grabbed, they're dead at that point, but you can grab all these zebra mussel shells. Zebra because they're black and white striped. So how can something that small be that big of a problem? Well, it's actually, we're like on this red alert here in the high desert. If you go up to, on your way to Lake Arrowhead, there's what's called Silverwood Lake. If you guys go to launch your boat, your boat has to get inspected. And they're inspecting for this little guy. You'll even see signs around there because they will basically take over that whole lake. Okay. In the Great Lakes, what they've also done is, other than just taking over the lake, drainage pipes, they totally clog them up. So then you're in that extra expense of having to clean out those pipes and everything. Okay. So even though, a termite, really? A termite. But yeah, okay, down in Louisiana, a huge problem, these termites. Other than when they had Katrina, they also have termite problems as well. Go ahead. So pythons, doesn't matter which type, but pythons, people like always getting these exotic animals, but again, they don't realize just how big they're going to get. Pythons get very big. So what they do is they get freaked out, they release them like out in the Everglades, okay? And so they're not starting to see, but the pythons, can reproduce fast. They have a big appetite. Think about how big they are. If you're that big, you have a big appetite. And they're feeding on the natural birds, mammals, and reptiles that are supposed to be there. So they're estimating there's tens of thousands of these pythons in the Everglades now. So there's people, that's literally what their livelihood is trying to track down these pythons. And I don't know if they kill them, maybe they skin them, make some nice pair of boots out of them, I don't know. But they're a huge problem within the Everglades. And, it's kind of, the Everglades are kind of creepy as it is anyways with the crocodiles, and there's alligators in there as well. But then you got these pythons, okay? And they're basically outcompeting eating the food of what is naturally supposed to be there. Let's see here. So we don't have to go in detail about this, but what is being done about invasive species? If you take my 170L class, that's the lab class 2, this one, it's 1 unit. I show you a film from National Geographic, and it's about these invasive species. Okay, and a lot goes into just with the research efforts. Some of this is very high tech. Okay, they use like those infrared goggles and everything in order to find. They can differentiate between different vegetation species that way. It's very expensive. They'll do it from helicopters, and it's like, oh, well, I can see this outbreak of that particular plant in that area. But then how do they take care of it, eradicate it? Well, that's done by hand. Okay, so a lot of time and a lot of money that goes in trying to eradicate and trying to maintain these invasive species. Go ahead. So what can you do? If you do have a python, don't just release it out in nature. You can turn it into the authorities. They're not, believe it or not, if you willingly come in and turn it in, they're not gonna, lock you up or anything as a result. They'll be very grateful that you did that. But, just don't go dumping things out in nature because you don't want anymore. Try to hand it over to the proper authorities because they'll take care of it for you. One of the big ones here is when you're camping, only use local firewood because you could get firewood, let's say it was even just 30 miles away and they have an infestation of a particular beetle and it's within that firewood. Well, until you use it up, that beetle is going to start propagating and having more, beetles escaping. So only use what's local. And a big one is if you guys, as you're going out, always clean your gear, especially if you've been in muddy situations. That is a really good way of tracking seed in the bottoms of your soles with that mud. So make sure you clean your gear at the location. Don't wait till you get home. Go ahead. All right, so we went over these. Keep going. Click. Keep going. Yep. And I think one more. Okay, so what this is showing you here from your book, figure 511, is two different, well, this one is showing you what's called, this one is biomagnification, okay? And go one more. No, go back, sorry. So what's happening here is there was a chemical, really long name, so we call it DDT, okay? And what they did is they basically dumped this chemical. For the most part, it was for mosquito control in wetlands, because if you guys ever been to the Midwest or East Coast in the summertime, it is not fun with all those mosquitoes. So what they did is they basically took this chemical and they dumped it into these wetland areas. Not really thinking there could be any ramifications, because they were just concerned about killing the mosquito. Well, what they learned was that, yeah, when they initially put it in the water, look at how diluted that is. That's really, really diluted. But as you go up these trophic levels, going up the food chain, what happens is it starts accumulating, okay? To the point where there's these things that it's very hard to see with the naked eye, if you can even see it with the naked eye, zooplankton, okay? Look, just from it being dumped in the water, the DDT, what the concentration becomes in the zooplankton. And by the time you get up here, this is what's called an osprey. It's a raptor. So what happens is it gets dumped, the DDT gets dumped in the water. That goes into like the algae. And it also goes into this phytoplankton. Well, what eats the phytoplankton? Little minnows, small fish. Well, what eats the small fish? Bigger fish. What eats the big fish? Okay? The raptors. So as you're going up the food chain, what was happening is what was this diluted is now that concentrated. Remember a few slides back where I showed you like the California brown pelican and the American eagle, the bald eagle, sorry, ospreys. These raptors got highly infected by this in the sense that this DDT didn't kill the birds off immediately. What happened was it got concentrated within their bodies, and so when the mama birds went to reproduce, that chemical caused the shells of the eggs to be very thin. The calcium carbonate wasn't able to bind the way it normally does to develop that egg shell. And so when the mama bird came along to incubate her eggs, she goes to sit on them, the eggs would crack. And so they weren't having any offspring. Okay? And what happened with the brown pelican, the bald eagle, it came back faster. And so in America, we banned the chemical DDT. It's like we can't use it anymore. Okay, and then we started seeing the bald eagle and the osprey and all these other birds start coming back. But the brown pelican wasn't coming back as well as the other birds. And they couldn't figure that out for a while. And then someone had an aha moment. Well, what do you know about birds in the spring and the fall? What do? They migrate, right? Exactly. They go to the warmer weather. Well, what was happening is where they're migrating to, those countries don't have the same environmental laws as we do, and they were still using the DDT. So as far as the California brown pelican, they migrate to Baja, okay, and they were still using the DDT. The numbers were coming back better, but not as quickly as the other species. So then they realized, okay, well, that's why. Go to the next one. So let's see here. Polar bears and global warming, okay? This is what they estimate the number of polar bears. And as you guys know, basically the way they hunt is off of the floating ice, okay? Off of the patches of ice, and they go for the seals. And basically they have to live off of their fat, okay? And so typically as the ice expands, that's kind of expanding their hunting range. But that's not what's happening with the ice anymore. It's actually getting smaller. So that's making their hunting range smaller as well. So what happens is the winters basically are warmer, the ice is shrinking, and they don't have, there might still be the same number of seals, but because the ice patches are smaller and they can't get from ice patch to the ice patch because they're so far apart, they don't have the same food source. So back in 2008, they were placed as a threatened species. They're not endangered yet, but they are threatened. Go ahead. Oh, I'm pointing to you as if you, sorry. You're like, I don't have it. Go ahead. Yeah. So the difference between bioaccumulation and what's called biomagnification, that slide that was showing the zooplankton and everything, that was actually biomagnification. So that's happening between different species. You start off with the stuff you can't even see with the naked eye, or if you can, it's really hard, up to the very visible. And as you go up the food chain, it's accumulating. And the way that works too is as you go up the food chain, typically those animals have higher fat content, and that chemical adheres within the fat cells. Bioaccumulation is it accumulating and magnifying, but within the species itself. So this was like a baby minnow, okay? And it was exposed to the DDT, and as it got older, more and more concentrates. So this is within the species, this is within the food chain. So go ahead. So we're gonna start getting into some graphic things, okay? Another threat, again, is poaching, okay? In Africa, from where Neville is from, this is quite common, unfortunately. Wildlife smuggling, whether the animals are alive or dead, but when they do smuggle them, there's a whole lot of animals that end up dying before they get from to the final destination. So then they have to compensate for how many died by getting even more than they normally would have. They hope to prevent it through education, but why do people do this? It comes down to the almighty dollar. It really does. It's not like necessarily, oh, I'm going to go kill all the gorillas for whatever reason. It's because there's a price for that head, literally bringing it back. Go ahead. So this is showing a snare, okay, with natural, I think it's a female lion, okay. Again, they don't use the whole animal. They're only using it for, probably in this case, for the fur, as basically as a rug decoration or having it hanging on the wall. I don't have a problem killing an animal, but let's eat it, let's use it, you know, especially the entire animal, not just one part of it. Go ahead. Unlike the rhinoceros, that huge animal, and they cut off the horns. Now, why? Where's the money within the horns? Where are they getting? The ivory. And then there's supposedly medicinal purposes that have never really been proven. Some people claim it's like used as an aphrodisiac, but again, it's more of one of those placebo effects. It really hasn't been proven that it supports that. So yeah, they kill that animal. Think about how many people that animal would have fed, okay? And people are starving to death where this is occurring too. Go ahead. So 12% of all bird species are threatened with extinction. So obviously they're already endangered. They're not even considered as threatened, they're endangered, and they're potentially going to go extinct. So for the most part, nowadays, the reason being that the habitat. Okay, we're not killing them just for the feathers for the most part, but there are exceptions to the rule. 1/3 of 800 bird species in the U.S. are on the endangered species list. Okay, so the second leading danger is due to those invasive species. There's these plants coming in, taking over their native vegetation, what they would have normally eaten, okay? And sometimes you have a very, very special relationship. Sometimes it's that particular bird is related to only that plant, and that's a real big downfall when they're a specialist like that. It's like, well, if I can nest in different types of trees, that's cool, versus if I only nest in one particular type of tree, and now that's all wiped out, now what are you going to do? These are other threats, okay? They all affect, it's like, how does an oil spill affect a bird? Well, there's different types of birds. Waterfowl. This happened when I was up at Humboldt. It was kind of ironic. The month after this oil spill center opened, because it was one of those things, not if there was going to be a oil spill, but when. It's just a matter of time. And ironically enough, it was a month after this wildlife oil spill center opened up, and there was a spill in the bay, And so basically, you know, the birds, they suffocate and they drown. This oil is very thick and it weighs them down. And so what you literally do is you capture the birds and you wash them. We would, and just like the commercials, I know you've seen it like with Dawn and everything, how it breaks the grease. That's literally what we did. We washed down the birds, and then you would have to force feed them. And then they went through this whole series of steps that they went through. And then after we thought they were ready, we had this big above ground pool, and we would do what was called the float test. And the reason being is if we didn't get all this crude oil, which is actually very thick and heavy, we're going to release them back out in the ocean. They're going to end up sinking and drowning. So we would put them in this pool to make sure that they were thoroughly clean before we released them. Sometimes they made it. They passed the test, and other times they didn't. If they didn't pass the test, well, they had to go through literally the wash cycle again. Okay? But it was by hand. It wasn't like we put them in the dishwasher or anything like that. But it was very time consuming. And again, we had to feed them. We had to grind up their food, and we mixed it like with some bottles of Ensure, and then you put the tube down and you had to feed them that way. So oil spills are a really big factor when it comes to those shorebirds. Go ahead. So look at all those dead animals. I mean, some of the things they use them for, I mean, it's weird. It's like you see frogs that they blow them up after they're dead, and they have them like playing a banjo, really weird stuff. They'll take the puffer fish and they'll blow them up, you know, sort of thing. Again, you know, use them as wall hangings and whatnot. But gorillas, why do they kill gorillas? Yeah, what about their hands, Kevin? Ashtrays. Who thought of that, right? I mean, use my abalone show. I mean, I'm not trying to promote smoking, but they kill the gorilla and they use that massive hand as an ashtray. Yeah, crazy stuff. Go ahead. So because of this whole illegal trade system, back in the 70s, there was called CITES, the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species. It was signed by 175 different countries, basically saying we will not allow this trade to happen. But you know, there's that black market, but it was pretty open until then. It was kind of in your face. It wasn't any secret. Well, obviously now they have to be secretive about it. And then also there's what's called there's the Convention of Biological Diversity. So again, 193 countries, ironically not the U.S., okay? And that has been in place for quite some time. That wasn't just with our new president, I like to point out. So for whatever reason, the U.S. has not been a part of this. And what they do is they focus on these ecosystems. There's these hot spots. Certain ecosystems are more in danger than other ones. And so what they try to do is promote making people aware, yeah, we understand you're a fisherman and you need to fish. We get that. But you don't need to release literally cyanide within the water, okay, because it's not just getting that fish, it's getting other fish too. Or think about all the bycatch that you get. They're very effective with their fishing nowadays. They have these high-powered fish finders, and they literally can get a whole school of fish because they can track them down, okay? So, you know, with technology, there's pros and cons. It's allowed us to get more food, but at the same time, we're wiping out our food sources. Go ahead. So back in the 70s, there was the Endangered Species Act. It has been amended several times. Basically, it's been kind of revised several times, upgraded. And with the National Marine Fisheries Service, basically what this is saying, you have marine mammals are protected, not necessarily because they're endangered or threatened, just because they're a marine mammal. Just like migratory birds. They might not be endangered, but there's what's called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And so if you have, let's say, a raven nest, okay, there isn't a darn thing you can do about that nest if there's eggs in it. Now, if there isn't eggs in it, and if it's not an endangered or threatened bird, you can destroy that nest. But once there's eggs in it, you have to let Mother Nature take its course. okay? And that's just the mere fact that it's a migratory bird. And then we have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're the ones that determine which species, which flora and fauna is actually going to be put on the list, or which ones are going to get downlisted or even delisted. Okay, go ahead. So this is a local story here. This is what's called the Mojave chewy chub. Not found in many areas. If you ever go to this place, on the way to Vegas, there's some at the Lewis Center. It's called the chewy chub, small fish. And look at the habitat. It's kind of like in the middle of nowhere, and it's just this deep pond. Okay, so with that, obviously it is subject to habitat destruction. Think about all the evaporation. We don't have enough water, rainfall that year. Okay, so it's in a very specific area. So there's a research that's going on. In fact, the students at the Lewis Center with Matt Huffine, that they do all these research projects related to the fish. Go ahead. So federal agencies, except for the Department of Defense, basically they're forbidden to do any projects that are going to endanger an endangered species. Okay, so they can't do habitat destruction. But even if they are a federal agency, even the Department of Defense has to do what's called consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service. They can't just go blowing up stuff however much they want, whenever they want. They work it out with Fish and Wildlife. Okay, this whole area, you can blow it up as much as you want. We don't care. Have at it. Do your, your tank drills, whatever you need to do. But if they decide they want to go into a new, different area, that's when they have to consult. However, if it was the time of war, it doesn't matter. Then the security of our nation oversees the endangered species. Okay? All right. So there's what's called the recovery plan for every protected species under the Endangered Species Act. They have what's called a recovery plan. And basically this is how are we going to get this species off the endangered species list? What caused it to go endangered? And then we try to figure out, is it due to habitat? Well, how are we going to better the habitat? So what's weird is not all species that are on the endangered species list actually have one of these recovery plans. They're supposed to, but again, there's so many different endangered species out there and threatened species. It takes a while to do these recovery plans, and it's not just one person, and it takes a while for it to get published and authorized and all that sort of thing. But theoretically, every protected species is supposed to have one of these recovery plans to figure out how we can eventually get it off the endangered species list. And for, go back one. Private owners, they're actually given incentives, especially like farmers. Maybe they'll have like the kangaroo rat, something like that. So instead of destroying their habitat, they'll give the individual some incentives, not destroying the habitat on their land. All right, go ahead. So this is a royal toad. It is a toad that's found in riparian areas. Okay. There's also what's called critical habitat. This is habitat where it is known to be or has the potential to survive. Okay. So it's riparian, so it's along these rivers and creeks and whatnot. And as you know, in Southern California, what they did is the green was what was proposed back in 2000, but the red is only what was considered as its critical habitat. So when you go into things of this nature as far as conservation, you kind of ask more than what you're expecting to get, because the likelihood of you getting them saying yes to all that green is pretty much 100% no. So you're going to ask for more because you know they're not going to agree to that much. Go ahead. ESA, Endangered Species Act. Okay. it's only listed when that species is seriously endangered, and it varies for each species. What is a good population for the arroyo toad could be very different than what was a good population for the brown pelican. Okay, brown pelican maybe is literally like 500,000 versus the toad maybe 5,000. So you can't have like this blanket statement. So it's considered for each individual species. Okay. And this isn't something that's gonna get fixed overnight. Okay, it's not even within 5 years. It literally takes decades for this to go into play. Just like, you know, the eagle and the brown pelican, that's taken literally decades. And it's still not to the height where it used to be. It's a lot better, but it's still not at what they used to know it as. Go ahead. So ways to improve, really first and foremost, in order to establish these other ones, is to have more money, is really what it comes down to. If you work for like the Fish and Wildlife Service, Forestry Service, any of these type of conservation environmental groups, agencies, you ask them and it really comes down to the funding. They're just undermanned. Okay, and the amount of work and what it's amazing what they're actually able to accomplish with what few people they have. Go ahead. So Theodore Roosevelt, he established wildlife refuges. The first one was in Florida. He was really into nature. And by 2012, there's 555 national wildlife refuges that are now protected. Most of them, not all of them, are wetlands, because we like destroying those wetlands because a lot of times the mosquitoes, or the wetlands along the coast we destroy because we want to have more marinas and harbors, or have condos, beachfront condos, that sort of thing. So a lot of it is wetland related. But unfortunately, plants are not protected at the same level as animals are. Okay, go ahead. So we started, even here at VVC, we have what's called a seed bank. And basically we have different seeds from various locations. In the event there was a wildfire that broke out, okay, we still have that genetic diversity within the seed where we could still propagate those plants from all these different fires that we've had within the last couple of years. And this is starting to become a lot more popular and of more interest to a lot of people. Okay, so what happens, did you know that there's like this giant seed bank in Norway for, you know, when Armageddon comes, that sort of thing? Yeah, there's one person that has the key. Well, not necessarily, but you know, the seed, because of a lot of what we're eating nowadays isn't the original seed that we used to use, and it's what's called those genetically modified organisms. Okay, and so it just doesn't even have the same nutrition value a lot of times, but then again, sometimes they create these GMO plants that are actually more nutritious than the original. But, you know, again, we don't have that diversity. We're starting to eliminate, not starting, but we're eliminating it a lot more even with our plants. Go ahead. Salton Sea, a really great area that is for migratory birds. But unfortunately, there's a lot of controversy that's going on within that area with the Salton Sea as far as the environment. Should it be protected? It's like, oh, well, you know, it's just an area for the birds, that sort of thing. But then there's water quality issues as well. So there's a lot going on there, but it's a huge pit stop for those birds. Go ahead. I'm not all that much into zoos and aquariums, depending on what they have there. When I was a kid, I remember going to the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, and there was this massive lion, and it was in this like concrete cage. And I was like, oh man, if you go to like the San Diego Zoo, it's vastly different. I mean, they have this open wild land that the animals get to roam around and everything. They're not on this cold concrete, and they have shade, and they can go, you know, they literally make the animals go hunting for their food. They're not just thrown a big slab of meat, you know, that sort of thing. So I'm going to be talking about this tomorrow as far as captive breeding and egg pulling. When it comes to birds, it's called translocation. or captive breeding program, and I'll talk to you just exactly why that's done. And something that you guys might have heard of is natural deficit disorder. Okay, we're also in tune with what's going on Facebook and Twitter and all that sort of thing. Kids nowadays, you know, they walk around and they have videos, people walking into telephone poles because they're not watching. You know, and I always stress to my son, okay, if you have a phone call, which he doesn't have a cell phone, but you know, when you do have a phone, don't be talking on it, walking across the street, or, you know, texting as you're walking across the street. You know, it's very dangerous, and we rely too much on our technology, these kids nowadays. Back in my day, you know, we just played in the dirt, you know, and it was a lot of fun. Made mud balls and throw it at each other and get in trouble for that, you know, that sort of thing. So we're really becoming disconnected with nature. Kids don't, oh, okay, I know the egg came from the chicken, but they don't know, they don't make that whole connection. Yeah, I know milk comes from a cow, but you should see the reaction on these kids when they actually see a full-grown cow or a baby cow. You guys are going to see that when we go to the dairy. I mean, you guys think, oh, it's just a cow, but you're going to be taking all your photos and everything, the ones that are just born. So it's kind of getting tapped with nature again. So actions needed. Okay, there's a lot of preventative action. Try to slow down the climate change. As you know, that's highly controversial nowadays, how it can be done, if it can be done, if it's even human caused. You know, we have all those different controversies about it. Reduce the size of our footprint. There's a way that all of us can reduce that, no matter how easy it is. Okay, go ahead. We did it. Okay, so make sure you review the 3 big ideas. So tomorrow, what we're going to talk about is basically my past experience with field biology, ecology, conservation. So I'm going to bring to you what I used to do outdoors and tell you guys about these different experiences that I had. Okay? All right, so have a good rest of the day, despite the very downing news this morning. Hope nobody was affected by it. And tomorrow's a new day. Okay? All right, guys.